Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with a story in which family members began to hunt for an inheritance, although their relative is still alive but has just fallen ill. Of course, you wouldn't wish such relatives on anyone. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Entitled relatives are trying to steal from my grandfather. For some context, my grandfather is my dad's father. I never had much of a relationship with my dad, but I kept in touch with my grandpa over the years just to check in with him and see how he's doing. He's a Korean War veteran and at one point was a prominent member of his local American Legion up until he was too old and weak to attend their weekly meetings. I assume meetings because despite being a member, I have no idea what goes on there. Family members are honorary members and I still get a new membership card each year in the mail. He's about to be 100 in just a couple of months. He's aware of the situation with my mother and he's always regretted not pushing his son to fight for custody of my siblings and I when we were kids. My dad didn't want kids and my mom had us just for the free money and child support. Recently, I got a call from my aunt who told me that my grandpa had fallen and broken his hip and he caught COVID at the rehab center that has now progressed into pneumonia. My aunt calls me every so often and she loves to gossip about the drama in her side of the family, but the drama is now revolving around my grandfather. My grandfather had often met some shady characters at the American Legion, many of whom weren't even members. But their policy of never turning anyone away allowed for these people to come in hunting for an older person to take advantage of. One of these people had been taking advantage of my grandpa for several years, taking money directly from his bank account and even taking out loans in my grandfather's name. My grandfather would hear about it, but this jerk, Dave, would convince my grandpa that the money was going to a new business venture or whatever scam he was cooking up and promised to pay my grandfather back. He was arrested for unrelated fraud charges. He was taking advantage of other elderly people. My grandfather never got that money back. My grandfather has a terrible habit of never saying no, and when he's stolen from, he just takes it in stride. I want to mention my grandfather invested in companies that are huge now, but back in the day they were small businesses, and over time those stocks grew and my grandpa's now rich. Rich to the point he could lose a couple $100,000 and not even bat an eyelash. He was a very frugal man who never wasted anything and saved every penny he could to invest in those stocks. The issue I have now is that my grandfather's relatives were caught trying to break into my grandfather's house a few days ago. A neighbor called the police on them and they told the cops that it was their right to go into the house because it belongs to them now that my grandfather's gonna die any time now. They were promptly told to leave and not come back. My aunt tells me they're calling the rehab center and demanding the keys to my grandfather's house so they can collect what's owed to them, which is absolutely nothing. They're my grandfather's nephews, so they aren't inheriting anything. My aunt, my grandpa's eldest, has already begun the process of getting a restraining order to keep them away from my grandfather and his home. As much as I want to be optimistic, I know the chances of him beating pneumonia are very low given his age, but it burns me up inside to know he isn't even passed and relatives are trying to steal from him. In case you're wondering, no, I'm not inheriting anything, and I'm 100% okay with that. And our second story. Stay off parish property? You got it. Let me start by saying I remember some of the specifics so poorly that I don't really remember if the piece of property and the people involved were actually the parish or the city, so I'll just be saying parish for simplicity's sake. If you don't know what a parish is, it's the same thing as a county. Louisiana thinks it's special, I guess, and needs a different word. Also, speech-to-text warning. I can't really remember exactly how long ago this was or how old I was, but let's just say it was in the range of 25 to 28 years ago, and I was in the 9 to 12-year-old range. Across the street from my house and just a little bit up the street, there's a small stretch of grass owned by the parish. There's nothing there but grass now, but back at this time there were a couple of trees and some kind of parish building and a bunch of orange work pickup trucks in the grass. One evening, myself, my brother, and a couple of friends that lived across the street at the time went around and collected some crappy boards, climbed into one of the trees, and made a very simple little tree house. Not even a house, just a platform a couple of us could sit on up there. We hung out up there for a little bit, and then it was time to go home. Not even an hour later, my mom got a hold of me and brought me to the front door. Apparently, a parish representative had been banging on the door and complaining about our treehouse, so my mom let him talk to me. He decided the best course of action was to talk to me, around 10 years old at the time, like a criminal, and that I needed to remove the treehouse. He didn't make any threats or anything, but his tone and attitude were very, "You did something really bad, and there will be consequences." Bear in mind, this was well after that building had closed for the day. I said okay, I'd remove it the next morning. It was just a few boards and wouldn't take long. I guess he was satisfied. Next morning, I head out to do it, and the parish guys are up in the tree pulling the boards out. Earlier than they'd ever been to work before. I was surprised, even at that young age. I knew that these people didn't know the meaning of a hard day's work, so seeing them there that early was shocking. From then on, I decided I would no longer mow the narrow strips of neutral ground just across the sidewalk outside our yard, nor the wide, long strip of property they owned that was about 15 feet away from my family's business. It was easily twice the size of the piece of land we were actually responsible for keeping up, but we maintained it anyway, just because. These people had their building on that piece of property where we built the treehouse. They never maintained it. They would let it grow up like crazy, and rats and snakes would take up residence and from there invade our yards. Every neighbor in the area complained to them, and it would take them months to get out there and mow the grass. Like I said, this was a small piece of property, and one guy on one of their riding mowers could have done it in 30 minutes. But that was just too much for them, even though they were more than happy to show up after hours to complain about a few boards in the tree. Basically, they pretended like they didn't care about the property when it came to maintaining it, but they had no problem throwing their weight around if you were on it. Now, with that out of the way, I'll finish up. Since I was no longer maintaining the neutral ground in the property they owned next to our business, it naturally started overgrowing. They would drive by and take pictures and file complaints and try to bully us into doing something. My mom would do it sometimes, as I guess she really didn't care that much, but to me it never seemed right for them to pick and choose like that, so I just went all in and didn't touch their property at all. Fast forward to today. I have an apartment about a 30-second walk from my parents' house where I lived at the time, and to this day, if the ground gets too shaggy, they tried to throw their weight around, I just tell them it's not my property. So far, nothing's happened. They let it get so tall that they need to bring people with heavier equipment than normal riding mowers out here to deal with it. And our last story. I fought the HOA and I won. This story takes place in Ontario, in the city of Kawartha Lakes, one of the worst municipalities in all of Ontario in which to live. There's poverty, crime, alcoholism, a culture of prideful ignorance, and die-hard partisan voters that'll vote against their best interests time and time again. The city council are looting their tax base to provide free educational opportunities for unqualified staffers they hired, holding secret meetings behind the public's back, and in one case spent $140K to fight a lawsuit that was levied against them after they blocked a brand new business's access road because some city council members owned a competing business. They were fined $70K and spent another $70K of taxpayer dollars to appeal and lose. That's all backstory. Suffice to say, it's a city run by uneducated rubes and inhabited by the most apathetic voters I've ever encountered. My old man was an original property owner of an unassumed road for 50-plus years. For the uninitiated, this means that although the city owned the road, they're not responsible for maintenance, grooming, etc., beyond the scope of the limited service agreement they made with a single property owner, who we later found out forged signatures claiming he represented the entire road. The LSA basically meant they would do 2 gradings per year, though they actually only provided 1. About 20 years ago, some city idiots, moved up on the road and decided they'd create an HOA. They didn't get insured, they didn't incorporate, and they thought they could go around forging signatures on city documents and charging residents money for essentially nothing. It all came to a head about 10 years ago. My dad refused to pay them until the 2 chuckleheads in charge showed him how they spent the money. Rather than provide a fair accounting of the neighborhood funds, the president and the treasurer both decided they wanted to sue for the money owing. Well, we went to court, and it turns out that you don't just get to declare yourself the head of an association that doesn't exist. Turns out you can't collect money from the residents and spend it on cookware and paying their unqualified, uninsured friends to do road work. Turns out perjury is frowned on in small claims court. They found out the hard way. I discovered in their court filings examples of perjury, fraud, and general dishonesty. They manufactured documents and got caught doing so. They were given multiple options to settle in court, but turned them all down, instead choosing to self-destruct in the most absurd and stubborn way available to them. None of their witnesses showed up. They brought literally no evidence with them to court, instead relying on the phrase, "It's not rocket science," and they somehow assumed the judge would accept "it's not rocket science" as some kind of evidence or as somehow lending credibility to their claims. He didn't. The HOA lost and ended up owing us money. The HOA dissolved immediately afterwards, and if the story ended there, it'd make sense, but not be a very interesting story. But you're not here for a good guys win story, you want satisfaction. Turns out one of those two old men that fancied themselves in charge of the HOA couldn't accept defeat. Our driveway light started to disappear, and someone was blocking the culvert in the middle of the night and washing out the road in front of my dad's house. Minor vandalism was happening almost on a nightly basis. So I came home late one night, and sure enough, this 70-year-old moron is thrashing about in the April temperature swamp, having fallen in after blocking the culvert. He's got his shirt tangled in an underwater branch and couldn't get out. We had to haul him out because he was so drunk and suffering from hypothermia that he couldn't even move. Then we called the cops. He got yelled at, trespassed, and no driveway lights ever went missing again, and the cops let me keep the trash can lid he was using to block the culvert. Free lid. Moral of this story is don't take crap off an HOA. They may look official, but I'll bet you most HOAs are doing something shady that'll reflect poorly on them in court should you find yourself at odds with them. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.